Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Ask an Anthropologist About Worldbuilding. And today, my special guest is Jordan Wyberneit. Jordan has done something really unique and actually done this very wonderful and interesting book called After the Anthropocene, where they built a whole world out of poetry, which is really interesting and amazing, and we'll dive into that, how you can apply maybe some of these techniques or ideas into your own world building shortly. Um, Jordan is a low-key feral, gentle healing, and wildly autistic. She whispers, "I love you" to hummingbirds and hornworms of which are in the book. There's hornworm point of views. Their work centers on systems of life, hybrid identities, and the complications that inform modern human experiences. She holds an MFA in poetry from Regis University and an MS in data analytics from Colorado State University. Jordan is the author of After the Anthropocene, available now from Avalon Park Press. Really wonderful, unique book, and an experiment of using poetry to really build out a fictional world with lots of really interesting perspectives. And of course, so we have questions about poetry and world building, but Jordan actually has a secondary focus, and that's data science. So if you have data science questions as well for your world building questions, I'm more than happy to ask those questions as well. So feel free to put those in the chat in the live stream. Let's talk a little bit about your work, Jordan. So what inspired you to write After the Anthropocene?
First it was my master's thesis. I kind of had this write a book, so we'll start there. The thing that really drew me to writing this book is kind of a curiosity about how humans are always at the forefront of the conversation. Like, we live in a very big world. We live in a world that is nuanced and very complicated, and yet the conversation is almost always from the human perspective and around what humans want to accomplish. And I thought, what if we didn't have to write from the human perspective? What if there was another path to consider what life looks like, and what sentience look like, and what agency looks like, and what considerations of a system look like? So I felt that that was enough to unpack in a single poetry book.
Yeah, and there's a lot to chew on in this book. I wrote a bunch of notes. Uh, it was really interesting because I'm part way through the book, and I get to page 26, and I think that's the fallen or falling or something like
Yeah,
that. It was like I don't know if that was an extinction event or what, but like I actually was like, whoa, what's happening to this poor world? Like, because you had already so deeply emotionally invested me in your fictional world that when something hits the skin and it's Degum, right? Degum is
that is correct.
and that's
Yep.
the name of the character, that it's like the world, or how would you
Right. Yeah.
describe that?
Yeah, so Dagum is the sentience of the planet. So it is the systems of the planet having their own form of agency. So rather than it being a fully Mother Earth figure, it is all of the networks of the world combining together into a unique and discrete character.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. You definitely use really interesting forms in the poetry. There was like a river section, and it was almost like a meandering river in the text. The way you did it,
Yeah.
it reminded me. Have you ever chanced upon the book "The House of Leaves"?
Yes. Oh my
Yeah,
God. What an
yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, your approach reminded me of that, and for any viewers who don't know, and one a really interesting perspective of like an existential horror book that also has some really unique world building. House of Leaves is a really great book, and there's this. It's about this. It's really hard to explain. It's like a story within a story within a story within a story kind of situation. But there's this moment when this documentary film crew is like going down these stairs, and the shape of these stairs and the internal of this house can change size and become infinite or shrink down to nothing. And so like the stairs are like growing in size, and so the book is a spiral. The text is a spiral that you have to read from outside to in, and there's you have to turn the book different ways. I read it for a podcast on my show I briefly did with a friend called literature obscura. We did a whole episode on it, and I just reading that book was actually kind of exhausting. Not in the way that your book was. Like your book was not exhausting, but that book was exhausting. I could only read like 30 pages at a time because there were so many strange things he had done and like layers upon layers upon layers of stuff that it was like really opaque in some places.
Yeah.
But yeah, I encourage people to check out House of Leaves if you want something really unusual in the format of prose. Uh, but also, this book, After the Anthropocene, I mean, this cover just kind of tells you really everything of really kind of what it's about here. There's all this organic life inside this rib cage. It's really fascinating. And that alone, actually, this cover reminded me quite a bit of there's a lot more science coming out about how, maybe consciousness is centered around the billions of organisms in our body that all kind of function into a cohesive whole, rather than something that's necessarily in the brain. And I really thought about that a lot when I was reading your book. And anthropology is also going down this multi-species approach now, where we're considering, the boundaries between human and the environment are not as clear as we used to think they were. This whole Cartesian dichotomy trap of man versus nature, or nature versus culture, or those kinds of things. So what else about this book? So what inspires you specifically to write something about After the Anthropocene? Because there's very clearly a world building event where the world itself is created or emerges, and then there's the moment when humans come in, and then the planes all fall out of the sky, and there's disasters all around, and there's this kind of moment afterward and a reflection on what that means.
Yeah. So the thing that really brought me to that, I mean, the current state of the world and the environment was certainly part of the conversation. What really led me to this is that, like, when we think about the idea of agency, we think about the idea of consciousness. The human perspective is very, very clear. We have an understanding of our world, but it's an understanding according to us. And we don't actually know everything. Science has more than proven that we are still learning an infinite amount of information about the world that we have and the world that we exist in. So my perspective was, what if we learned that the world is actually far more sentient and capable of its own self-correction? We know that the human body can self-correct when something is wrong. We know that there's a healing process that happens. You look at a forest fire. A forest fire has this natural recursive process that it goes through. What if we become identified by the system of the planet as the problem? The planet is already designed to self-correct. It is designed to kind of create a way for it to survive and to persist. And I thought, well, what does that look like? And I truly want for humanity to survive on this planet. We are a part of the natural world. We are part of all of the systems that exist here. Like, we belong here. We were sourced from this place, right? So I want humanity to survive, while also acknowledging that the current trend for humanity is wildly destructive. And so what would it look like if some other agency, if some other sentience needed to say, I've got to course correct and solve what is essentially a cancerous sort of situation? And what does it look like for the humans that come after that? Do we actually learn anything, was really the question. I think we're capable of doing that. I'd like to think humans could learn.
I think we are. I do. I actually am quite hopeful. And there's a number of reasons for that, which we could spend a whole day talking just about that. But yeah, your book is not nihilistic or any hating on humans or anything. You have page 45, to be human is not an act of desecration. And I thought it was really great as you put this right after your passage on the miners. And the miners is like very extractive, right, and destructive. But then the next poem is, to be human is not an act of desecration. So you're saying, like, this is what we're doing, but we don't have to do that, which I thought was just such a great and useful message to kind of to put in the forefront of the actual human section, or the hominin section. And I also was, some of the dates in this are like 2030. So I was like, so it's like some things are in the future for sure. So of course, if you pick this up in 2035, you wouldn't know that. But
yes, I did think about that. I was like, how far in the future should I set this? And I was like, well, people, I'm just going to trust the readers, you know,
Yeah,
trust the
yeah, yeah.
readers to land this.
Cool. Well, yeah, really wonderful book. Definitely check it out, everybody. Let's dive into your bones to pick about world building. So what things do you see about data science or poetry out in the visual media, or lack in the visual of media, or media more generally, whether that's books, films, video games, whatever, that are serious errors in factual world building?
In factual world building. Oh my. I think the thing about world building that irritates me the most is that people tend to fall back on what's already been built, instead of really stepping out into a more avant-garde space. And this is going to be slightly fussy, but when I look at a lot of like fantasy and science fiction, it's always entrenched in existent norms within those spaces. And I'm like, the human brain is capable of far more creative and inventive pathways to world building than this. Um, so it seems very derivative, I guess. And I think that we have the ability to build something that is more complicated and nuanced, rather than just saying, here's an advanced civilization and there was a form of capitalism and nobody designed a different path. I'm like, bro, come on. I think
Yeah.
that is my current beef.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's why me and my co-author Kira wrote Build Better Worlds, because we were like, you guys, you can
Yes.
do it better. Like, there's
Yes.
so many more ideas to play with than just the standard set of science fiction and fantasy and horror tropes that exist the
Yes.
world over. And so many. This is like I get it, people spend, like we were talking about briefly in like the green room or whatever before this about Dungeons and Dragons, and you know how much
Mhm.
time it takes to build a campaign, and I think a lot of people just decide that they jumped so much effort into their tabletop campaign that they're like, we should turn this into a book. And but then it
Yeah.
doesn't really give you, unless you're doing something like totally off the cuff kind of tabletop and you're writing a completely new world. I think it's, you just see a lot of kind of repetitive stuff, and you know, a lot of Eurocentric ideas. And I think the thing I really liked about this book is it that you wrote is that it doesn't really fall into the Cartesian dichotomy of nature culture, and it really kind of plays with that other sentience, and you know, agency is, it's really interesting to hear people use the word agency, because anthropology has a very specific meaning for agency, and that is your ability to make choices, but based on the social and physical limitations. And I think when you're building a fictional world, it is important to consider that choice is also limited by, you know, needs and social dynamics and all kinds of stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, agency and anthropology having a very niche definition is outstanding. I think I did not give that consideration. But what I think is, like, when I think about the idea of people making decisions within their cultural context, I would say that's possibly also one of my bones to pick, is that it is overwhelmingly, even when the culture is successfully renegotiated in world building, the perspective of the people is still wildly human.
yeah, yeah,
And so it does not actually translate. You actually don't get a different perspective. You just get, you know, what is often the Western culture's perspective, just landed in a completely different planet and ecosystem and language. And you're like, I don't think that's going to be true. But a lot of authors kind of lean into that.
well, and you see that in the building of fictional religion too a lot. um
Oh my God, yes.
yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
that, you know, just because when people think of religion, they think of the world religions. They don't think, they think about religions that have direct correlation to empire, that the focus
Hmm.
is to get people to think like a good citizen of the empire, because that's the whole point of tying a religion to empire, is to kind of unify morals and values and beliefs and ideas. It really has far less to do with the actual religion and the dogma of the religion itself than it does to have to do with the tie into empire. So, but you know, the world has 6,000 plus distinct religions, and only a fraction, a tiny, tiny fraction of them have gods. or deities of any kind, or higher powers, or anything like that. Some of them don't even have creators. The Piraha tribe doesn't even have myth in the way that we think of it, because they don't have the concept of past in their language. And so
God, really?
yeah, they're really interesting. If you all want a really interesting book that'll kind of blow your mind about what it means to be human with a language component, Daniel Everett's book "Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes." They don't have numeracy, they don't really have numbers, they don't have color concepts, they don't have past tense in their language, they have extremely limited future tense, and they don't have a myth structure in the way they have like myths that sort of shape their values and norms. But there was 200 years of Christian attempts at missionization, of which Daniel Everett was actually a missionary. He was down there at the Biraha because no one had been able to convert them in 200 years, not one single convert. And he got there and he found out, oh, it's because
Oh
they don't
yeah.
have a concept of the past. So you can't talk about a guy who came before and died for your sins, can you? Because what do you mean came before? Like you can't
Oh,
talk about,
amazing.
right. So it didn't compute. And to this day, there's still no converts to Christianity, despite many missionaries down there for 2 centuries. But you get stuck in these ideas, as you were saying with agency, that people, they're focused on the religion, and that they don't consider that there might be religions out there that were just inconceivable in English or
Hmm.
whatever language you're speaking. And that's true of an indigenous, like those indigenous individuals in the Piraha tribe could not conceive of Christianity. It made no sense to them whatsoever. So like there are humans who don't really understand each other that well. And side note, like the Piraha tribe is what blew up Noam Chomsky's whole universal grammar thing, and he was
Oh.
not kind about it at all. so, um, so yeah, agency is like, and it is in different sciences. They use words in different ways, as you know. With data science, there's
Yeah.
terminology that I have no clue about.
Yeah.
Um, so we're gonna open it up to questions here in just a moment. So other thoughts on things that you see in fictional worlds, out in the world, that really just kind of they bug you.
I, because we were just talking about language, that's going to be the first thing the thing that's in the front of my mind is that when I love science fiction and fantasy, and anytime we are dealing with the way that people construct their languages, like not like Tolkien where he had his whole like fully realized language, but I mean the way that like alien species are put into a language casket, it is always very like normalized, like the way that they approach nouns and verbs and the language and the constructs of, help me out here buddy, and the constructs of like self within language and others within language. um that is a thing that irritates me when I have to go and read a book and I'm like, that is definitely a Western civilization perspective on humanness and existence and the self within relation to the other and other in relation to the broader culture. And I think that if you consider that an alien species will have had an entirely different language construct, they will have formed those different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just not evidence. And I understand that's very difficult to kind of communicate that, being it's going to be a book written in English, but I just
But
think we could
it's
do better.
but the film Arrival shows you can do it. If have you ever seen that one?
Oh my God, that was an amazing film.
Yeah. I'm covering that one in my first episode of Anthropology Through Science Fiction, in part because like the director and the director of photography, the writer and the director, Villeneuve, who did Dune and all that, he did an
Oh yeah.
incredible job of sort of. So this is a big spoiler, everyone. If you don't want to be spoiled to Arrival, just
Skip.
skip. But he took his concept of an alien language and really applied the world building through and through, such that he actually messes with, so the whole concept is this species comes down and they're trying to communicate, this linguist, Louise, she's trying to communicate with them and discovers very quickly that their language doesn't have a sense of time. And as Louise begins to master this language, that sense of time changes for her. And suddenly she realizes that the heptapods, the species, have memories of the future, past, and present all simultaneously available to them because their language is essentially so different from humanity that it has to be, they write it simultaneously with like this almost like organic ink that they squirt out, and it's really incredible. So she figures out really quickly that that she can kind of see the future, and this all happens in the moment when humans are doing this typical human thing and they decide we're going to kill the heptapods because they're threatening us and we don't know why they're here and they're different and they're scary. And she uses her ability to leap to the future in her memory to pull valuable information to derail the military campaign, and it's brilliant. But at the same time, the way that the director does it, he presents like what appears to be flashbacks of Luis's child dying of cancer right in the beginning of the film, and you're like, what the hell is this child is dying, but it's actually in the future. So he literally messes with the timeline and the visual images of the film to build this sense that, you know, things are straight line, and then you get to this point in the film and you're like, oh my god, because she asks at one point, she's like, who is this little girl you keep showing me? And you're the whole time thinking that she had just lost her child, and you're just like,
Yeah.
wait, what? So they do a really incredible job with the visuals, the images in building their fictional world, and then really playing with that concept of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is controversial in social science, and I've done an episode on my channel about it, but it's obviously a case of hyperbole. If you learn a different language, your brain does not reconstruct your sense of time. But it's certainly, Sapir-Whorf does impact your language and your culture. And I think that was one thing I really liked about your book, was that you played with language and form and repetition and cycles in ways that was almost kind of unsettling. And I don't mean unsettling in a bad way, but in a way that just kind of just knocked you out of your sense of thinking, and I thought that was really well done. So again, tip of my hat to you about that. So
Thank you.
but let's open things up to questions. I've got a couple of here I had from people who sent them in early. So first question, and I thought this was a really good place to start. What does poetry offer world building that no other format does?
Oh, interesting. What does poetry offer world building that nothing else does? I think poetry is an invitation. Like when people walk up to poetry, they expect to have a slight unveiling, but there to always be mystery. So I think there is a willingness when you walk up to a poem to intellectually engage with it, to sit with it and consider what that means for you. I think in like fiction or in prose, people have an expectation that the author will have communicated enough that they can fully understand. And that expectation just does not exist in poetry. In poetry, you can let the mystery sit there. I would also say that, as a poet, it is a privilege to be able to say, how much do I want to unveil and how much do I want somebody else's brain to engage and create their own experience? And how do I make space for them to have that experience? Because, a poem could be extremely literal, but when it comes to world building, I think poetry just lends itself to the human imagination taking and running with the concept, as opposed to me as a writer delineating everything you're going to understand.
Yeah, so it allows you to kind of imbue a sense of mystery, right? So are there certain kinds of fictional worlds that you think would benefit more from poetry than others, or certain genres maybe?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think it kind of depends on, hold on, let me reflect on that. Do I think that there are types of writing that would benefit most from poetry? I think I'll answer in a tangential way. When I got my MFA degree, I took many, many series on, I was in the poetry program, but I took seminars on creative nonfiction, on regular fiction, on memoir, on biography, and like all of these different genres. And so I incorporated that information into my degree program and into my understanding of poetry. So when I think about the idea of how can other genres, like, are there genres that would best benefit from having poetry? I think poetry is a practice. It is a method. There's a way to reflect on the forms and the structures and the approaches in poetry and incorporate that into anything, whether science fiction or traditional fictional narrative. Like, I think there are ways to say, okay, this is something that poets do and they do it often and well, and so I will incorporate this into the way that I approach my writing. And it could be anything from the way that you format things on the page in a given chapter to the way that you break up or do not break up a long body of text, as opposed to just having it in a traditional structure. I think I think oh god, let me change that. I think genre is crap. And I think if you are writing a book, you want to have a chapter that's in poetry, you should have a chapter that's in poetry. If you want to have a section that's in poetry because that is the best form to communicate the thing you need to communicate, knock it out. So I think should put poetry wherever it makes sense to further your narrative and bring your readers further into your story.
Yeah, I think I think that's a great answer, and I think that for people who don't know, genres serve two groups of people, let's say primarily, marketers and academics, and
yes.
Beyond that. Genre is real murky, and I know when I was working on the first episode of Anthropology Through Science Fiction, I was like, okay, we got to define science fiction because this is a semi-academic approach we're taking here. But I took a whole section to define it because I was like, this is really complex and there's going to be no neat definitions, and how do we define what was the origin of science fiction and all this kind of thing, and it was kind of this messy go round. So and I think it is, for some people, it's super important to consider genre if their goal is to sell lots of books. Yeah. But like typically people like you and myself are not as hyper-focused on the selling of things, right? Whereas we are as focusing on the experience. And in my first dark fantasy horror novel, which is like the first book of a series, Shades and Shapes of the Dark, I do use poetry as kind of epigraphs. And it's a little bit of a giveaway. You really figure it out in the second book, which I'm getting close to finishing the first draft. But in the second book, it becomes very clear that some of these epigraphs of poetry are fragments from ancient lost text of occult magic that this person is finding to figure out how to deal with this terrible monster that's following her whole life. Some of them are like riddles where she'll literally read messages of this ancient lore, and there's an answer for her to how to like forge a weapon against this creature in it. And so it's some of it's kind of almost breaking the third wall, warning you to not read on, all kinds of stuff, right? Which is like a whole, I can't say more than that because it's a huge reveal for the finale of the whole series. But it was, I had never really used poetry, and I had written poetry independently of prose for a long time, but I had never really thought of it as something I could effectively use in poetry. And then I just was like, yeah, but Edgar Allan Poe did it a lot. He used poetry in his writing to convey incredible stories. I mean, stuff that like everybody knows the poem The Raven, and that whole thing is a really incredible, hard driving poetry on top of being an incredible, dark horror story about grief and loss. So, I think that's a really, a great kind of a great thing. Another question I had was, since poetry gives you the opportunity to experiment with format, in ways that prose doesn't, is there certain ways that you could use this in the building of your fictional world? Like maybe, so you talked about a little bit about deciding to just do it in certain chapters in certain places, but are there other ways in the actual construction of the world that poetry you think could be useful?
It's an interesting question. I like my brain just went like several different places.
That's okay.
I read a book. I read a book, and I'm shy to say the name of the world because I've never actually heard it said out loud, and I'm so sorry, I cannot think of the name of the book or the author, but it's a science fiction book, and the entire culture that this character goes and visits, like they all of their communication is poetry based. Their histories are poetry based. Their language is poetry based. If you're a great poet, you are rewarded. They have like fancy dinners with slam contests, essentially. And it's going to irritate me that I cannot think of the name of this book. And so when I think about how do you consider poetry within a cultural context in another book, that is the first thing that comes to mind. Restate your question for me, because I think my brain went off. What is the question again?
So in what ways can you use it in the creation itself of the fictional world?
I think just acknowledging, I think just acknowledging that other cultures are going to have a form of lyrical or flowery language. I think that is a pretty consistent thing that exists across cultures. And considering what that's going to look like on a different planet, in a different world, within a different cultural context. I think, again, because of, I'm an American, and so I have my understanding of poetry is entrenched into this particular culture. It needs to take a certain form and a certain shape in order to qualify, quote unquote, as poetry. What does it look like if that is not the case? If you have a culture and their entire text-based system, if they have a text-based system, what does that look like? If they don't have a text-based system, what does their oral traditions look like? Oral traditions often being associated with poetry. And then how do you have those conversations about what does that look like? Like in the American world, your poetry tends to be constructed with nice pretty languages, there's metaphors, there's a lot of imagery. Is that always going to be true in an alien world? I don't know. Maybe that's not how they write their poetry. And then when you start unpacking, okay, if their poetry is not, maybe their poetry is math-based. What does it look like if somebody's poetry is math-based? What does that do to your understanding of what constitutes poetry if poetry is actually just algorithmic math that is set out, and that is the thing that is beautiful and poetic to this other species? I'd say that would be one way that you could consider unpacking poetry within your world building, is what does poetry actually look like for a different culture?
So like an elegant equation would be like considered poetry, maybe by another civilization. That's interesting. Yeah. To your point on oral traditions, a lot of oral traditions are poetry, and a lot of them rhyme or have kind of mnemonic features because then that's easier to memorize, right? I know in my study of Eastern philosophy, you see a lot of like, there are 4 noble truths and an 8-fold path. And, so you have like there's 6 paramitas. And so there's like numbers, and then corresponding with those numbers, they kind of match up so that it's easy to keep those things in your memory rather than kind of lose sight. So I guess, if you're building a fictional world, it can be super useful to use mnemonic devices in the poetry so that not only does it stick in like the characters' world's minds, but that would also be sticky for your readers' minds in a lot of ways too. And I think you really do this, especially in like the very beginning of After the Anthropocene, when you're repeating these phrases over and over again, and you're playing with them, and almost like sometimes like word swapping the order and stuff. It like is so sticky that you like. I was thinking about it after your book release party. That's where everyone, by the way, I got introduced to Jordan's wonderful book, was at her book release party. And some of those things that you read on the mic, they were sticking in my head for a while after. And so you kind of captured some of those mnemonic devices. So, and that's like forms of poetry too. Like, so let's talk about that for a little second. Like, what kind of important forms of poetry make prose sticky?
Oh, ask that question one more time. That's a great question.
So what kinds of forms in poetry, like alliteration, for example, make prose more sticky so that your prose is actually more poetic?
Okay. So I use repetition a lot, and you're correct. I do use repetition and then switch the words slightly. And that is very intentional because it is sticky. I think in prose, you're taught not to be repetitive. You're taught to find new and inventive ways, like do not use the same adjective and
thesaurus everywhere, right?
Toss that right out. I think there's a lot of power in repeating the same thing because it makes the reader think, why is this the important thing? Why is this the recurrence that is happening over and over and over? See, that's what I just did. So I think repetition is pretty important. I think mouthfeel, this is something poets talk about, mouthfeel of words. So when you sometimes you read a sentence and you like feel like I read in my head and I literally hear a voice reading the words out loud inside of my head. Okay. Um, and so I will read through some prose and I will hear it and I'll be like, man, that's amazing. And then you read it out loud. You're like, wow, that feels amazing to say. Just to like construct it in my mouth and say those words is amazing. I think every now and then, like poets are taught to read our stuff out loud. I don't, prose people are not taught to read their books out loud. You should read your books out loud and see what feels good. What does it feel good? Does the words feel true as you are reading them out? If you're reading through a very painful, choppy scene and you read it out loud and you're like, it actually sounds like I am speaking this beautiful thing. Well, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to put some hard K sounds in there. Maybe you want some really guttural type of language in there, because the human brain, while it is reading, if you're like me and you read it out loud, they're going to be like, yeah, that is a rough sentence. I think leaning into that kind of experience is interesting in prose.
Yeah.
That's your question.
Yeah, it does. And it made me think, like, could you, if you're trying to inhabit alien emotions, because despite what a lot of people think, emotions are not universal, like anyone who says that,
Amen.
there's a bunch there's a bunch of anthropological literature out there on how emotions are not universal, no matter what psychology says. But if you're trying to embody the emotions of another culture and you're working with the language, there might be certain sounds that you could incorporate to kind of capture that strangeness, or that, in some cases, otherworldliness, with mouth sound. And I had never thought about that before until you just said that. But it's really funny because until I started hanging out with all of you poets, like, because I had been mostly a prose writer for most of my life, but about 5 years ago, I started hanging out with poets a lot more often, and I started finding it very difficult to just write in my head. Like, I've started, even in my first drafts, I now have to like say the words out loud, to the point where my son sometimes comes knocking on the door and he's like, "Hey dad, can you like keep down the stuff a little bit? I'm trying to listen to this thing." I'm like, "Put your headphones on, I'm working." but it's something that I've never thought about, that you could actually maybe embody the alien emotional experience by changing consonants to something awkward and strange. That's a really interesting thing to play with, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you have other thoughts on that? Like, if you have more to elaborate on that, I'd love to hear more.
Man, I'm trying to think. Try to be brilliant, Jordan. No, I don't know that I have anything else that I would I don't know. Ask the question again. See if something else pops up.
Well, let's use an example. So back to that film Arrival. The
Yeah.
composer, the music, the violin and the strings music for that is so incredibly unreal and strange, and I don't know how he
Yeah.
did it. It's very otherworldly, and as you're experiencing, he almost like embodies the clicking and the strange motion and guttural noises of the creatures in the orchestral score. It is one of the most unique scores I've ever heard, and
Distressing.
it can be distressing in some
Yeah.
cases. And it is interesting because as you're watching this film and you're getting into the heptapod, not octopod, that's a different thing. The heptapod. The heptapod, octopus, octopod, octopi, all that stuff. As you're getting into the heptapod kind of culture, as Luis is being integrated with the language, I feel like you start to understand the sounds as well. And they have like their own kind of poetry or poetic kind of feel to them. There's these kind of phrases that appear in the composition. Honestly, I was reading about this composer. He died, I think, of some weird thing young, but like he didn't win he didn't win the best score because the one of the editors decided to add a song from another film into it, so
That's right.
he lost the original score award. And I was like, but like that wasn't even his choice. Like, you know, like it's not like he said let's incorporate that in there. On the Nature of Daylight, which is an incredibly beautiful song, but it's in like 30 movies. So but yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about. So using certain sounds in language, in sentences, for emotions. That was me reiterating for you. So
Mm.
any other thoughts on that?
How do you use poetry to make people feel things? No, I have no other thoughts on that. It's
um
the end of my thoughts.
no, that's all right. Let's see, I have another question here. um how do you think that poetry could be used to enhance interactive world building, like video games?
Oh, wow.
That's a good
How do
question.
I, poetry could be used for interactive narratives. That's wild. So the first thing I'll say is I don't play video games because modern video games make me super nauseous. Like
Mm,
the videos and the graphics and stuff, my eyes are like, absolutely not. But I love the stories in the video games. I think video games are interesting in that they really create the entire world and then you get to experience it in often a first person way. I would incorporate poetry in the same way I would incorporate it into other world building. I would have it like tacked up on a wall. You would walk up to the bar and walk into the bar's bathroom, and there would be somebody has chicken scratched a beautiful poem on the side of the wall as you find. Um, I would put it everywhere. I would put it in the art forms. I would reconsider what the art forms would need to look like. Um, and then add just poetic lines or have people spouting off poetry in the background. I would put poetry everywhere, my friend.
yeah,
Um,
I do feel like not every video game. I'm playing Death Stranding 2 right now, which is a really incredible science fiction horror mashup, about a world where they actually discover you can, when you die, you go to this place called a beach, and everyone has their own beach, but then some people get stranded there, and then also like once they started doing scientific experiments with the beach, they cause kind of an unleashing of these terrible creatures called beach things that get released out into the world and cause like an apocalypse. And so you're trying to reconnect the world through using this technology with the beach, and they do some incredible stuff with art and poetry and music. And it's really truly it's very unusual because you're a delivery guy. That's the whole game. You're just delivering packages, and it feels so, you're like, what the hell is this game all about? Like, it took me like 3 tries to get into the first one, but then it becomes this incredible narrative about connection and humanity. And it's also very strange because in order to be able to see these terrible things that are trying to like kill you and drain your life and all that stuff, you have to carry around like a fetus on your chest. It's like a little portable, and like a little it's like a, what do you call it, like a little artificial womb that you're carrying around. And so
oh my God.
the main character falls in love with this child, and of course there's complications because the child's not supposed to, it starts growing in the artificial womb. They're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to be kept in stasis. So there's all kinds of really interesting stuff going on, but there's not directly poetry in that. But I'm only a third of the way through the second game. If I suddenly came across a poet, I would not be surprised in this world, because it really is. It is very strange and unusual, and every time you think you understand what is happening in the story, it throws you a curveball. It's incredible.
That
So
sounds amazing. Like everything you just described, it sounds like a surrealist poem.
yeah, it
It
is
sounds
very
like a surrealist
surrealist.
poem.
It is
Yeah,
very,
just like
yeah.
letting the vibe like run with it, and your brain just kind of like grabs the words and goes for it. Um, I will openly advocate for surrealist writing for anybody. By the way, if you're
What
stuck,
what
writer's
is
block,
surrealist
write some.
writing?
You So writing surrealism is just leaning into the absolute weirdness that your brain does, honestly. So it's often just taking a thought and going as far as that thought will take you without trying to constrict it into something normal,
Mm.
right? Like like my cat was just on my lap. His name is Benedict. That's fine. If you want to write a surrealist poem, you're going to say, okay, my cat is on my lap. My cat weighs 25 pounds. He's massive. Like the size of the cat is massive. What happens if he's a 35-pound cat, a 50-pound cat? What happens to me if I have a 100-pound cat in my house? What happens to the cat if the cat is 100 pounds inside of a domestic house? What happens to the domestic house if the cat weighs 1,000 pounds? That is surrealist poetry. You literally take whatever thing your brain is like here's this nice soft cat. What if the cat was made of razors instead of being covered in fur? Okay. And then you just run with that idea. What would that be like? What would my experience be like? That's surrealism. You just lean into something weird and let your brain run with it. If you're trying to design an alien species, there you go.
I feel like I have been writing a lot of surrealism and haven't realized it.
Yes, I
I'm
can
not
confirm.
I'm not like classically trained in literature and stuff. I just read a lot of books and love writing and stories. And I did take some creative writing classes in college, but it wasn't, my major was anthropology. So I like it's always funny when I go to these poetry events, I don't know all the terminology. So real quick, what are there certain forms of poetry that people don't know about that you think would really enhance their fiction and world building?
Oh man, I will tell you that I'm a big fan of the pantoum as a form. It's a repetitive form. I'm also a big fan of the villanelle, which is okay. I like repetitive poetry. I like poetry that's got cyclical lines in it because I think it's interesting and because it lends a degree of effort into the creation of the poetry. So yeah, the pantoum, big fan of that. The villanelle, I'm a big fan of that. I hate sonnets with everything in me. If you hand me a sonnet, I am going to be like, this is so great. Thanks.
Well, can you give me
um,
examples of each of those forms? So for someone to, I mean, you can even if you have examples in your book, you can always read some out of there
I,
too.
well, here's what I will tell you. I love forms, but I also break almost every form that I touch. So yes, I do have a pantoum, and yes, I do have a villanelle, and yes, I broke them in
Hmm.
my book. Because at the end of the day, a form is a structure,
Hmm.
right? It is a direction and it is a guideline. And the idea that you have to follow the precision of some form to the T in order for it to be a quote unquote good poem is trash.
Hmm.
So I take the framework of the poem, I make it identifiably that form, and then I change it. And do I have examples of that? Absolutely. As soon as you asked me that question, did I forget them? You betcha.
um, could you? Here's a thought, and we could always add stuff into the description of this episode. Could you find examples for us, and I can post examples of it was a
Oh,
pantoon, and what was the other?
Pantoum and Villanelle.
And
And
villanelle.
absolutely, there are many out there. There are many famous poems. I will provide you with a list of them.
Awesome.
Um, yeah.
You know, I think the other thing that poetry really helped me with my fiction was just making the imagery more powerful, helping me um to really make my metaphors more like fresh and not cliches,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of cliches in fiction. I read someone the other day who said if they come across a single cliche in a book, they put the book away. They don't care how famous it is. They don't care. I was like,
Jeez.
geez, that's a high standard. It's like I can't say I've always avoided cliches. I try to, but you know, I mean, we're creatures of what we read. So, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, how does ambiguity work differently in poetry than in prose?
Ooh, how does ambiguity work differently? Well, poetry, you have basically consent to be ambiguous. You can be a bit more vague and not be penalized for it, I would say. In prose, sometimes if you're too ambiguous, you leave too much open. I feel really sorry for prose writers because, like, if you're too vague, you get demonized for it. If you're too explicit, you get knocked for that too. In poetry, we're just like, I wrote the poem. And they're like, yay. There's more
Yeah.
tolerance. there's more tolerance for vagueness. I think it's really, in poetry, they talk about, in the academic circles, they talk about deciding how much you want to reveal. This is particularly true in like the author's analog or the poet's analog or confessional poetry. Like, how much do you want people to fully understand whatever is happening? And so poetry lets you be extremely vague. All right, you can have a poem that's nothing but metaphor, that's about the worst trauma of your life, and nobody will ever know, because it's all wrapped up in metaphor that may or may not be comprehensible. And that's a decision that you can make as a prose author as well, just understanding that, you know, people are be less tolerant of it. In poetry, you can be very vague. You can also be, not to go back to surrealism, but your metaphors can be something that somebody has to sit with. So like one of the poems that I have, it's called Motherhood is an Open Throat.
Mm-hmm. Great poem.
What does that mean? What does that even mean? Like, that's not even a thing that could happen, but it is a thing that you can say and mothers are going to be like, word, right? Like, it is an understandable experience of having an open throat, even though the language itself doesn't make sense. So when you think about constructing language, you know, in your world, it doesn't necessarily have to be, it doesn't have to make sense linguistically if it makes sense to the reader functionally, if they're just like, I understand what is happening right here.
Mm-hmm.
So I think leaning into that is an interesting way to approach narrative.
Yeah, it's like you're not necessarily, well, I mean, and that's, I think, something that poetry does really well is it sometimes invokes those vague emotions that we don't have the language for, or the
Yeah.
combination of a dozen emotions, like you're feeling, you know, you're in the middle of a disaster and you feel guilt because you're a survivor, you feel shame because you didn't, you know, prepare, you're angry because the situation is frustrating, you're depressed because you've lost part of yourself, you know, maybe you feel joy because despite everything there's this beautiful flower that remained in the rubble. Like, you're feeling all of these emotions, and sometimes prose just can't really, there's no words for it, you know.
Yeah.
But poetry gives you, like, motherhood is an open throat. It gives you something to be like, oh, I mean, and I'm a father, but I can still kind of
Yeah.
understand what that
Mhm.
what that feeling is the mother has to some
Yeah.
degree. Like, and of course, you know, all writing is an attempt to teach empathy to one another in a lot of ways. It's a way to get us to understand one another, even if that understanding is trying to align belief. But yeah, that's an interesting, that ambiguity in poetry can be used, or you can use the ambiguity of poetry in prose to evoke difficult moments for characters.
Mhm.
That's a really interesting point. Um, what about for like a script, like a movie script?
Oh, what
How would you
about a movie
incorporate
script?
poetry or poetic techniques into a script?
Oh, that is really interesting. I would avoid rhyming at all cost. So poetry is often some poetry. It is a snapshot. It is not, when you think about poetic narrative in a poetic form, it is small little snippets, and sometimes they are microscopic snippets, right? You think they're epic poems, sure, there are also haikus. When you think about, or you have just a single image and the poem is nothing but that image. So when I think about something like a screenplay or a film, I think about how can you convey the thing that you want to convey in the most poetic way, right? Um, I saw a I saw a 5-minute play that had no words whatsoever. Do I remember who wrote it? Absolutely not. This is a feature that I have. You're welcome. A 5-minute play, and it it shows a scene, and then it shows a highlight of a teacup, and then it shows a scene, and then they flashed over and showed this image of this teacup, and then another scene with no words, and people are moving around the screen, and then cut the lights, and here's this teacup, and that is the 5-minute play. Okay, that teacup is a poem, because that teacup is a metaphor for everything else that happens, and it continues to pull you back every single, like, here's the same deeply traumatic scene, teacup, And what does that teacup mean? And what is the space of the teacup? The teacup never changes. It never moves. It's on its little plate. It's this fragile little thing. And here is all of this chaos that happens around it. And it keeps pulling you back to this. That is what poetry does. Poetry is like, here is this tiny thing that you're going to ground yourself in, and is going to frame your entire understanding of everything else. So I would say, when you're considering something like a screenplay, what is the teacup that you can bring into this conversation that's going to keep pulling people back into this, to this kind of grounded space, which is what poetry does, which is also what the repeating lines in poetry do.
And it's also what good
Yes.
world building does. Good world building continues to ground yourself and ground you in the immersion of the world, so that there's nothing that pulls you out and makes you think about your life. Like those are the books where just like, I can't stop reading this thing. I like it, you just keep going and going and going. And so that kind of grounding effort, that's a really interesting insight. And it actually reminds me, I'm a huge Stephen King fan, and I was rereading the book Black House, because he's coming out with the third book in that series in October, and it's been like a 20-year wait or whatever. So I was like, I better reread it. And I've noticed that in the way that characters think, like that really good writers will give you this line, oh God, I'm trying to think of the line. It was something like, Gorg fascinated him and took him to Abala or something. And so the character will be thinking about this wife's note, which was like very poetry and very obscure and strange, because the wife was having some kind of like psychotic break because her kid was about to get kidnapped by this demon possessing thing, right? But he would be sitting there, he'd be thinking, and he would be like going through his day, and he keeps coming back that Gorg fascinated, Abala, whatever, over and over again. And so like it's this grounding thing, like your teacup thing. And I had noticed it as a technique before, but I guess I just had never really thought about it as something for a kind of like, in the case of a horror novel, you're talking about the centering in the constant stress and tension of discomfort, right? Maybe, and I don't know what this teacup necessarily, but it sounds like you were mentioning it was fragile. It was standing there, and all the chaos is happening around it, and at any moment maybe it could break or something like that. Or like, I know George R.R. Martin in Game of Thrones, there's this moment of one of the characters being extremely jealous that this other character is spending time with someone, and so they'll be going around, and someone had like said something to make this character feel jealous. It's been so long since I've read Game of Thrones, I couldn't tell you which characters were doing what, but I just remember thinking that, like, wow, it's really interesting how he keeps coming back to that same line in the character's head. It's almost like I'm being forced to constantly think about the jealousy that this character is feeling. And that's actually super useful for thinking about world building, because depending on what you're doing in your fictional world, there are things sometimes you cannot escape. So having the images that keep popping up and keep grounding you in those images could be a super useful way to keep your reader or your viewer or your gamer immersed.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting you bring up George R.R. Martin. I read like I read the books several times, some of them, and in one of the books, Daenerys Targaryen is reflecting on the red door of this one house where she lived with the lemon trees with her brother, and
I remember
she was like 12 years old, right? And when she loses her shit in the books, bro, she is reflecting, and she was like, she has this clear vision, and all of the doors were red. That is the end of the chapter, is all of the doors were red. And I was like, one, she has just gone insane. And every single red door for the next like 3 books, I was like, oh my God, there is an insane person in this land. And like, so it can be as simple as that, right? Your character has this little dream, and it's very happy, and it's a great memory. Every door is red, and every single red door that happened for the rest of the series, that is all I could think about, was this one character's moment of her trying to recapture what was an innocent and beautiful moment in her life. I think that's poetry. I think every door being red is poetry, right? Because as a reader, I was like, that's a great simple line, and it just like landed and stuck. I think you could pull poetic lines into a narrative like that. Yes, as not a prose writer, obviously.
it's So interesting because like I think my takeaway from our whole conversation here today is that poetry is what grounds you. And
Yeah.
I had never thought of it like that before because, you often think of poetry as like woo woo, right? A lot of people think of
Yes.
poetry as woo woo. But I think our conversation has made me really realize that what poetry is this incredible grounding feature. And if you're trying to get people to stay in your fictional world, you need to ground them in it, in the sensation, in the memories, in the laws, whatever it might be. um, your goal is to ground the reader in that world. And so that makes me really think that poetry is even more vital to world building than I had thought before we had this conversation. So thank you
Yeah.
for
It's
that.
it's interesting that, like, when I think about the idea of poetry being grounding, so I'm gonna lean on William Carlos Williams here, right? He wrote a poem. This is just to say is the poem. It wrote a very long time. It's a very short poem, but this is just to say that I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were so juicy and so cold, right? This thing blew up Twitter some years ago. And now there's like, it goes everywhere, this particular poem. And if you say this is just to say, or you say something about poetry and plums, people who do not read poetry understand what you are about. You can introduce something like that in your world building to have it be the thing that pulls people back. It is just like this small little cultural nuance. I can walk into any coffee shop and be talking and ask people if they know about plums in an ice box, and I can guarantee you people are like, oh yeah, absolutely. They may only know it from Twitter, and they may not know it was William Carlos Williams who wrote that poem, but they are going to know that there were plums, they were stolen, and somebody did not get their breakfast plums. Okay, like this is this is the joy of poetry, is it can be something small and simple, and it's just this clean little happy image that people just cart with them forever. That poem lives rent free in my head. So
Yeah.
several of his do, but that one in particular.
Well, and that's the true meaning of a meme, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like before we get into the internet memes and what we think of those, but that's like the true meaning of a meme. And I mean, imagine if you can get your fictional world to be a meme. I mean, that's pretty powerful. Especially in the day of social media. So,
Oh Lord.
okay, so I wanted to finish up our conversation here today with the question of, if you know absolutely nothing about poetry and you want to think about ways to improve your prose, what poets would you recommend people consider reading?
What poets would I recommend people consider reading if they want to write? Okay, that's such a great question. For me, who is terrible with names, that is outstanding. Here's what I'm going to tell you. This is a slightly biased list. Um, it's not slightly biased, it's way biased. There is a new book out by Megan Foley called Psych Ward. It is literally a story of characters. A story of characters. Mental illness is a character. Doctors alike. It is an outstanding book, and it literally will walk you like, you will read this book and be like, this is both prose and poetry together, and it is a phenomenal way to think about creating characters and narrative through wildly different lenses.
I have that. I
Um,
have that book too. It's really good.
it's outstanding. Full transparency, Megan was in my MFA cohort.
Yeah. And full transparency, I know Jordan and Megan both from open mics. That's where we all met.
So that is one book that I would recommend. What else would I recommend? You Better Be Lightning by Andrea Gibson is a fantastic book, very accessible. And if reading books of poetry is really intimidating for you, Andrea Gibson was a spoken word poet and has a lot of stuff available online where you can go and listen to the poetry. It's a different perspective. If you want to understand like how to really embed like culture and like a political conversation in poetry, Saul Williams is a great way to go. To people.
Poe, we talked about Poe earlier. Yeah.
You want some classic people? I would stay away from. I would stay away from a lot of classic poets, personally. But no, Edgar Allan Poe has some really dark crap, bro. Oh my God, that's my cat.
A 50 foot,
Am
a
I able?
50-foot, 500-pound one.
Yeah, it's correct. Congratulations, you're going to be a poem, buddy. Um, Poets with narrative. What would I say? Read Tolkien.
Yeah.
I would also say read unexpectedly. Leonard Cohen's poetry is
Yes.
bro, right?
Yes. Leonard Cohen's stuff is incredible. Like The
Yeah.
Stranger. I mean, he's a poet first and a musician second. It's like pretty obvious.
Yeah.
The Stranger song is like this incredible. I will listen to that thing on repeat for hours sometimes.
Yeah.
I just trying to understand the feelings that it invokes. Yeah. Dylan too. I mean, Dylan has some
Hmm.
incredible stuff. And like I know Death Cab for Cutie, like the music might not be for everybody because it's very emo, but they have a really incredible ability to tell a story in just a couple of lines. Um,
Yes.
like the song What Sarah Said, which is about watching someone die. I mean, like, it came to me then that every plan is a tiny prayer to Father Time. And
Yeah.
then, as we sat in the room in the ICU that smelled like piss and 409, and you're just like,
You
oh,
exactly.
whoa.
Like
Yeah.
you're like, there's an image, and you're like, I'm in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of wonderful musicians that use a lot of poetic license to consider for sure. But
Mhm.
yeah, Leonard Cohen is, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned him because he's like, whew, for me.
Yeah.
So,
Or like really smart poetry. Well, I mean, like the lyrics in his songs would be, yeah, really smart poetry, complicated, soul crushing,
yeah.
nice stuff.
But again, back to sometimes using those kinds of ambiguous or obscure language to invoke emotions that catch you, that really immerse you. So, yeah. Any other final thoughts?
Um, I did have actually one more thought as when you were talking about the smell of 409, like in your prose, please incorporate things that are not vision and sound, make something smell bad, make somebody have a taste experience, and like land it hard. Like pick really specific smells, right? The smell of Dawn soap. Everybody knows what Dawn smoke smells like. It's a very distinct Dawn blue, right?
Yeah.
Lean into that and let people just have that experience. You don't have to describe the smell. You could be like, it smells like dish soap. It smells like ivory soap. It smells like X. Lean into whatever that image is or that sensory experience instead of just describing the thing.
Yeah.
Um, that is something that poets are constantly harping about is we need to have different sensory experience other than taste, touch, and sight, right? Lean all the way into whatever that experience is going to be.
Yeah. And like, if you don't know, smell is your most powerful memory. All your most
Yep.
powerful memories come from smell. I mean, I would be walking down the street and will smell something, and I'd be like, "Oh, in second grade, I smelled this, and this exact thing was happening." I'm like, I can't remember anything else that vividly. So yeah, incorporating smell into your world building, very powerful, very powerful.
And what would that look like for an alien species? Because they will also have a different olfactory experience.
Oh yeah. I mean, you think about the range of sense organs, and I talk about this in my
Mhm.
you could find I have a free essay on cognitive maps in world building, and talking about how like different sensor organs will necessarily create different culture and social experiences. So something to definitely to consider. What would an alien? What would like? Maybe they don't have smell receptors or their smell receptors are very tiny, but they might have like a completely different kind of vision or whatever. Those are important things to consider for sure. Or what is the ground smell like to a screwworm, right?
Mhm. Yes, exactly. That's what I'm talking about.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about incorporating poetry into world building. Some really cool
It's my
stuff here
pleasure.
today. And yeah, definitely check out the book After the Anthropocene. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It will really kind of make you think about humans' place in the world, and incorporating other non-human species into your work. And also, of course, always, build better worlds. We are actually talking about doing a second edition coming out next year, so I'll start ramping up on that when that's getting closer. But thanks again, Jordan, and we'll see you all next time.
Awesome. Thank you.